Welcome to Mutual Exchange Radio, a project of the Center for Stateless Society. I am your host, Zachary Woodman. Today's guest is Maggie McNeil, an author, journalist, and blogger who is an expert on sex work. Herself a former sex worker, Maggie has written a series of short stories on sex work published as Ladies of the Night, runs her own blog, The Honest Courtesan, and has had her own writing featured in outlets such as The Washington Post, Reason Magazine, and Cato Unbound. Most recently, she was featured prominently in the documentary The War on Whores, which you can rent on Vimeo. Today, we discussed the legal and moral issues surrounding sex work, in which Maggie gave her strongest case for decriminalization and responded to some common objections, as well as the social and moral implication of its decriminalization and normalization. You can tell Maggie really knows the empirical literature on this topic, and that made for an especially informative conversation. I hope you learned as much as I did. And without further ado, here is Maggie McNeil. Welcome to this episode of the Mutual Exchange Radio. Joining me today is Maggie McNeil, an advocate for sex workers' rights, and today we're talking about the ethics and legal issues surrounding sex work. Hello, Maggie.
Hello, Zach. How are you?
I'm fine. I guess we'll start out by asking a bit about your personal backstory because it runs against some prejudices people have in approaching this topic, and it might be a good place to start. So what exactly got you interested in this topic so much?
Well, in a way, I mean, you could say in some ways I'm a born whore. It's just something I've always been drawn to. Ever since I was about 14 years old, I've used sex to get things that I wanted. So I used sex to be social. I used it to say thank you to people. I used it for fun. I used it to be cool. I used it for money. I used it, for any kind of conceivable reason you could think of. So it's always been a pragmatic thing for me. And so after my first husband left me in 1995, I found the librarian's salary, because I was a librarian at the time, was just simply not going to do it. And so sex work was the obvious choice for me, and I haven't looked back.
Yeah, and you say the word choice because like a common refrain you'll hear from prohibitionists in approaching this issue is that it's not really a choice for most women. So for you, you think it really was a choice that you made?
It's a choice for everybody. The only people it's not a choice for is people who are literally, forced with a gun to their head sort of thing, or with such strong coercion, we'll kill your family, that kind of thing. These situations are rare, though. I reject the argument that a constrained choice is not a choice. That's completely nonsensical. You would not say that about any other kind of work. Nobody says that, right? Nobody says that a person who's working as a Walmart cashier, for example, that their choice to work as a Walmart cashier was not a valid choice. It's a nonsensical and misogynistic argument. The idea that because basically what it all boils down to is this very Victorian notion that women don't have true sexuality. So basically that if a woman is doing anything sexual for any reason other than the permissible feminine excuses, having babies, because you love somebody, lie back and think of England, whatever, that if you do it for any other reason, that means that you're being constrained and some evil man made you do that. And of course, this is like I said, it's an extremely misogynistic viewpoint. The example I use quite often is that if you had, for example, a young man, and he has graduated from school, and let's say this young man's in New York, and he has got a lot of student loans, and so he's got to get a job right away. He can't just sit in his butt, but he gets offered this really great job, lucrative, by which I mean lucrative, in LA. Now, let's just say this particular young man, he hates LA. He doesn't want to live in LA. He has no interest in being across the country from his family. He doesn't want to live there. And the conditions require very hard work. But in a few years, he'll be able to pay off his student loans and get some cred that he'll be to use to apply for better jobs later. And so he goes and does it. Well, what does everybody say? Everybody says, oh, what a great work ethic you have. Oh, how wonderful that you're a hard worker and you're making these hard choices to go and do this and get ahead in your life. But if that person facing that choice, that may be kind of unpleasant choice, is a Filipino woman from Manila, and the job that she's looking at is a hostess at a hostess bar in Japan, she's making exactly the same choice. She may not want to do that job. She may not really want to go to Japan. She may not want to do that work, but it's lucrative. And in a few years, she can come back. She can help her family, and she can, have gained some experience that she may be to use to do something else. So the only thing, the problem is that people think that sex is a special case, and that simply isn't true. Sex does not magically make everything different unless the person chooses to make it different. In other words, if in an individual's mind it's different, then I suppose it is for that person. That doesn't mean it's different for me or for anybody else.
Right. Obviously, when we're talking about women who are making a choice to get involved with this, like with really any exchange, what exactly choice means in that sentence can be a contentious issue. And you're saying the bar for sex work, where we call it a choice, should be the same as any other employment avenue.
Correct.
Essentially. Right.
Correct.
So
sex is not magic.
Yeah.
Sex, people want to put these magical concepts on sex. And at one time, before the invention of birth control, before there was such a thing as safe abortion, when there were serious social issues for pregnancy and things like that, that may have been to a degree true, right? If there was no real way to potentially stop yourself from getting pregnant, then sex is a different thing. But that's not the world we live in anymore. We have not lived in that world for several generations now. And even before the advent of good birth control, condoms go back farther than you think.
Right. And there are some people who I think your example of someone taking a job with Walmart who would say there's some exploitive relationship going on there, and they would want to apply that standard to sex work. So what would you say about, especially coming from a Marxist persuasion, will make this type of argument, what would you say to someone who makes those type of cases?
I have very little patience for that. What I tell them is, you go ahead and get a universal basic income established in our culture, and once that's done and once that's in place, then we'll talk about this.
Okay. So you think
because until then, people have bills. I have bills. Everybody has bills, right? You've got you keep a roof over your head. You've got to get food. You've got to put gas in your car. You've got to pay insurance on your car. You've got to pay, health insurance. You've got to pay, all the different expenses. And if somebody's not going to give you that, then your choices are, what is the job I can do for the skill set that I have that's going to bring me the most money for the least difficulty in work? And when I say difficulty in work, I mean everybody has their own things that are important to them, right? Flexibility of schedule, flexibility of type of work, whether or not you have to work under somebody else, where you can work physically, all those sorts of constraints. And for many, many women, sex work is the best available choice. That's not to say that for those women it is a perfect job. That's not to say, I've met women who loved sex work. I've met women who hated sex work. I've met many, many, many women, the great majority, who would shrug their shoulders and, it's a job. And I think that's the way people are with lots of jobs. I think back at my father and mother, in their jobs, in their square jobs. And they didn't always love their jobs. They didn't always think, my dad used to work shift work when I was very young. And I sincerely doubt he enjoyed getting up and going to work at midnight until 8 a.m. I just don't think that was, that was his idea of an ideal job. But he did it because it was part of his job. He liked the job in the other ways. It was good money. It was very secure. It had very good benefits. So he made that choice, and nobody questioned that because he was a white man. But when it's a woman, especially a woman of color, people want to start putting all sorts of layers on top of that choice. And they want to say that, oh, no, your choice is not a real choice. I've never heard that term, the choice not being a real choice, applied to any male, for any male job. So for women, our culture seems to feel very comfortable, making that judgment.
So you bring up a really interesting point when you say, like, universal basic income, we have it, then we can talk about whether people are not, or what taking away that choice is a good thing or not. So your point is basically like, look, even if you have some other objections to it, at this point, given the way our economy is structured, it is the best choice for many people, and taking it away is harmful to them.
Correct. A friend of mine, Mark Drawn, who writes the Windy Pundit blog, he once pointed out that if you are in a burning building and you are trapped on the 5th floor of the burning building, jumping out the window is not a consequence-free decision, right? You could break your leg, you could, but if you decide that it's better to jump out that window than to stay in the burning building, to take the risk, to take the negative possibilities that jumping out the window could bring you, how does it help that person who's in that building to board up that window? And that's what the prohibitionists want to do. Prohibitionists want to board up the window. They want to say, nope, you have to stay in this burning building because we don't like you jumping out that window. We think that, we don't want to see you with a broken leg. It's like, we'd rather see you burned, presumably. There's an example a few years ago. There was a program in, I don't recall which of the countries it was. It was one of the Southeast Asian countries. I believe it was Cambodia. I could be wrong. Where there was a program that the government was offering to, quote, get women out of sex work, close quote. And the amount of money that this program paid the women was 1/10 the average income of a sex worker there.
Wow.
1/10. Imagine you suddenly having some authority figure come to you and say, oh, no, we don't like the work you're doing. It offends us in some way. So now you have to take this other job that's going to pay you 1/10 as much. And if you can't make your bills, tough, too bad, so sad. But it's better for you. It's better for you because this other kind of work is noble. And we don't like the work you're doing.
So we're obviously sticking to the legal side for a minute here. There are obviously some really negative repercussions of criminalizing sex work.
Oh, yeah. Plenty of them.
Yeah. Let's go through, not just for the women involved, obviously, but for sort of society at large. Like, do you think it has an impact on domestic violence? And
it has an impact on everything. It has impact on the clients. It has an impact on the sex workers. It has an impact on the families of both. For example, if a man is caught in a sting, what does that do to his family? If they put his picture in the paper, now they're ridiculing him in the paper. What happens to his kids when they go to school? What happens to his wife? Does it help them? Does it help them if the wife, because of her upbringing, feels betrayed by this and decides that she has to divorce him? Well, it enriches some lawyers, but does that really something we want? To break up the home, to put socioeconomic privation on the women, because let's face it, divorce in general is not good for women, right? Most women end up poorer after divorce than they do. I mean, of course, there's high-profile stories, and in the upper middle class and such, women can do quite well after divorce, but not in the lower middle classes and in the working classes. That's not the case. And in fact, a lot of the girls, when I used to have an escort service, a lot of the girls that used to work for me were divorced because the ex-husband wasn't providing enough to take care of the kids. And so, you have these kind of things. You've got, and from the sex worker side, so many, just being a friend of a sex worker, just being a friend or roommate or the landlord, family members, any of those kinds of things can all be affected by criminalization, either directly or indirectly. For example, the majority of when you see news reports claiming that a person was charged with pimping or that we arrested a pimp or that kind of thing, the great majority of the time, what they're describing as pimp are people who are deriving some kind of material support from a sex worker. So, for example, it could be a roommate. It could be a landlord. Landlords are charged with pimping sometimes. Drivers. If a sex worker has a driver that she pays, to take her from place to place, he can be charged with pimping. If two girls share an in-call, that they share a location that they work from, they're sometimes charged with pimping each other. These are all very common things, and it's not the stereotype of the pimp, right? Everybody pictures this stereotype from a rap video, and that's not the case. That's not mostly people who are being charged with pimping, or just more or less it's people who are friends or associates of a sex worker in some way. In India a few years ago, there was a tendency for the government to charge the adult children, college-age children of sex workers with pimping because they were living off their mother's prostitution income. They didn't charge them with that when they were minors, but as soon as it became, over the age of 18, they would charge them with it, even though the mother was supporting them to get through university. So what the government is basically trying to do is lock them out of the educational system. You can't live with your mother because your mother's a sex worker. So, these, and this is just, the tip of the iceberg. That's not even, getting into the incredible social ramifications of this, the wasted money, the expansion of the police state, the expansion of police powers, the undermine, just like the drug war, right? It's the same thing, right? When you have a consensual activity, you can't, if there is no complainant, the only way to police a consensual activity is surveillance and trickery, and as, I'm sure most of your audience would agree that those things are bad.
Mm-hmm. So one interesting avenue to go down is you mentioned sort of the stereotype of the pimp sort of in this abusive
Mm-hmm.
relationship, the sex worker. And some people might think that that's just the way, sex work is always going to be criminalized. But to what extent do you think, to the extent that exists, which I think it's probably less common than people think it is.
It's way less common, yeah.
To the extent that exists, do you think that that's a result of criminalization?
No. I think and I'll tell you why I don't think that. I don't think that because of the numbers, because the numbers are very interesting. Mm-hmm. In the West, developed Western countries, Europe, Australia, North America, Canada, Canada's part of North America, but you know what I mean. What we see roughly is that the rate of coercion in sex work is about 2%. Mm-hmm. Now, by a not at all coincidence, that happens to be roughly the rate at which women say on surveys and such that they have an abusive or controlling boyfriend or husband. So if 2% of women in the general population have an abusive or controlling boyfriend or husband, and 2% of sex workers are coerced into it, how are those different phenomena? The fact simply is that roughly 2% of the female population, for whatever reason, is accepting of, falls into relationships with abusive, controlling men. It's just that when the woman who is in such a relationship is a sex worker, we have a special fancy term for it, pimp. If she were a school teacher, we would not call that abusive husband a pimp. We'd call him an abusive husband. In other words, what we mostly see is that the majority of the true pimps, I don't mean, the roommate who's arrested as a pimp. I'm talking about an actual bona fide pimp. It's a domestic violence situation, is what it is. And it should be treated as such. And by pretending it's something different, you undermine the possibility of that woman actually getting what she needs.
So you think to the extent that violence exists in sex work today, it's just all the same causes as the way domestic violence exists today, and
yes.
that
Yes.
criminalizing sex work is just sort of pretending that the issue is something that it isn't.
Correct. It's representing domestic violence as being a different thing for sex workers than it is for other women. And of course, this is part of a bigger picture, because there has long been the pretense that sex workers are not like other women, that we're not normal, that we're somehow different, that we're somehow not real women or not good women or whatever. And when you do this, what you're doing is you're taking attention away from the actual causes. You're putting up a red herring here. By pretending that we're different, you take that same phenomena, domestic violence, and you pretend, oh, we need to give it a different name, and we need to have different solutions for it, and we need to have these extraordinary things of, police powers and such to fight this scourge. Well, this scourge happens to be the same scourge as the rest of society. It's just that we're pretending it's something different.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Mutual Exchange Radio. I just wanted to put a quick plug in for the Center and all the great work that our writers and scholars do at C4SS. We have a ton of informative studies, articles, and essays about market anarchism from our scholars and authors. This project and all of the Center's work would not be possible without the help of our donors and supporters. In particular, Mutual Exchange Radio is supported by Patreon, and if you like the show, you can help us out by pledging a monthly gift at patreon.com/c4ss.org. That's patreon.com/c4ssdotORG. I'll mention a few more details about how you can help out at the end of the show. Thanks, and now back to my conversation with Maggie McNeil. All right, so one interesting phenomena under sort of criminalization of sex work that we've seen is, which I think would be an uncomfortable spot if you were a Marxist who's so rapidly opposed to this, is this recent complicity that has showed up between corporations and the state to go after sex workers. Well, there was, I think a few years ago, you had an article in Reason about credit card companies going after transactions online for
yes.
Or was it Marriott, the hotel chain that recently said, like, if you're
Marriott is Marriott is not really any different, and I was perfectly happy with the attention being focused on Marriott. Mm-hmm. But Marriott's not doing anything that the other hotel chains aren't doing. Hilton's doing the same thing. All of them, they're all doing the same thing. The Westin chain, all those chains are all doing the same thing. Largely because of pressure from the government, pressure from social pressure. They have to look like they're the good guys, whatever, to the general public.
It's a marketing PR.
What set Marriott apart was merely that Marriott hit one of their goals as far as like what percentage of employees they were going to indoctrinate. They hit this goal and they crowed about it. Mm-hmm. That's the only difference. It's not that the others aren't doing it. It's that Marriott hit that number first, that 100% or whatever number, the number was, and they crowed about it online and sort of attracted attention. They stuck their heads above the parapet. But everybody else is doing the same thing. It isn't just Marriott. Marriott may have pursued it more aggressively because they're Mormon owned. So they've often, Marriott has often made big grandstanding things about vice issues. Like a few years ago, they took porn out of their hotel rooms, the porn on the TVs and things like that. So, I think it's partly just their corporate, the image they want to present. But like I said, really and truly, they're not doing anything different than anybody else. But what they're doing what they're doing is still something we should pay attention to. I'm not saying don't pay attention to it. I'm merely saying don't think it's only Marriott, because it ain't. I have known friends who've had hotels, violate their privacy. I was talking to a lady online very recently who was, and again, I have no proof of this, but I have no reason to doubt her either. She said she went to her room, and she was an escort, and she was on tour. Went back to her room, found her key card didn't work. Went to the front desk thinking, oh, it's just one of those things where your key card gets demagnetized or whatever, and you have to have it reprogrammed, and was told by the hotel, oh, no, we turned it off. And they were, at that moment, ransacking her room as preparation for kicking her out. But they were looking for some sort of, I don't know what kind of quote evidence, close quote, they were looking for. But she didn't get arrested, lucky for her, but she got thrown out of the hotel. And this kind of thing happens, right? Or we see the story like the story of the woman that was published in that magazine just about a month or so ago, where she was told she couldn't order dinner sitting at the bar because they were trying to get rid of prostitutes. And so, she couldn't order dinner. An individual woman sitting alone at the bar couldn't order dinner at the bar at that restaurant anymore because they considered that an anti-prostitute measure. In Sweden, the Supreme Court of Sweden actually ruled that it was not discrimination for a bar to forbid Asian women from coming in because their excuse was we're fighting prostitution. So they had this very racist trope of that, Asian women in Sweden are prostitutes, and the court actually allowed them to do this. The court allowed them to say, basically, no Asian chicks. And this is something we talk about in sex work activism, that a lot of the things that are portrayed as being intended to control sex workers are actually intended to control women in general. Mm-hmm. It's just that sex workers provide a socially acceptable target. And so you can start, it's the first they came for the communist thing, right? You can start by saying these rules are against sex workers. And by the time women in general realize what's going on, it's too late. By the time it's too, it's the hotels are surveilling women traveling alone. And you've got things like women being harassed by the TSA on flights because they married a man of a different race and their child doesn't look like the same race as them. And so they're being harassed on flights and things like that. So it's a surveillance and attempt to control women who step outside the bounds of what society traditionally considers appropriate for women, such as traveling alone, for example. Right? Women aren't supposed to travel alone. We're supposed to travel under the quote protection, close quote, of a man. We're not supposed to marry outside the race and have children of a different race. We're not supposed to charge charge money for sex. We're not supposed to do any of these things. And so these laws and procedures are intended to enforce that social order, that very conservative social order. And I'm using conservative there, not in a political sense, but in a socially conservative.
So sticking with the legal issue for a second, a common refrain you'll hear from prohibitionists, especially on the feminist side, sex-negative feminism, is that Sweden and these Nordic countries are a model for how sex work criminalization should work, because allegedly in those countries they target the Johns and the traffickers rather than the sex workers themselves. Is that what it actually is? Or
the term? Well, first of all, the term John is very, very funny to those of us in sex work, because even though it's possible that I think that actually was an actual term used by sex workers at one time, it was used by probably like street workers around New York. Mm-hmm. It's not a term I've ever heard a sex worker ever use, except quoting cops and things like that, or using expressions like John schools. It's very, very funny. It reminds me of that. Whenever I hear cops and such, using the word Johns, it reminds me of that meme we've all seen with the old guy with the hat backward and carrying a skateboard, saying, "How do you do, fellow kids?" That's what it reminds me of. It's like they're trying to sound like, "Ooh, we're using street talk." But nobody uses that. Yeah. So clients, we say. But so the idea that behind the Swedish model, first of all, there's two things I have to say about the Swedish model. One practical and one philosophical. Let's do the practical one first. Practically speaking, how do you catch clients? If you're going to only arrest clients, how do you catch them? You set up stings is one way, but the other way, and the simpler way, is to simply surveil sex workers. And that's what they do. That's generally what they do in Sweden and Norway both. They surveil sex workers. So they're basically trying to arrest clients coming in and out of their house. There's a cop in Sweden, Simon Hagstrom, I believe is his last name, who's made a second career out of traveling around trying to sell the Swedish model. And he had a book that he released a couple of years ago. And he has a lot of pictures in it. And he's got pictures in it of things like him sitting on another cop's shoulders so they can look in the window of a sex worker's room and take pictures of her with the client. If you think that that's somehow positive and helpful to women to be spied on by cops and have, cops lurking outside their houses and harassing their visitors, I don't think even in a feminist mind that could be considered to be a good thing. Number two, how is pinching off a woman's income supposed to be some sort of positive outcome? It's not, right? I mean, depriving a woman of rent and food is not a good thing. It's not a helpful thing to her. And then a third practical consideration is that just because there are no criminal penalties for sex workers in the Nordic model countries does not mean there are no penalties. They simply aren't jailed or fined. Norway had a police thing that they actually named it Operation Homeless. And what it was sending letters to the landlords of known sex workers telling them, we can prosecute you for pimping if she lives there. What's the result? They get evicted, of course. And unless you try to go find another place, right? Because when you put what's the place you lived last, you give your references, and then they call him. Oh yeah, she's a sex worker. Don't let her live with you. So they actually purposefully were intentionally trying to get women evicted. They were trying to render women homeless. That's real feminist. There was another case a few years ago of a woman who was expelled from university because she would not mouth the shibboleths. She would not pretend that she was somehow oppressed being a sex worker. She would tell anybody who talked to her, no, I like it. I enjoy it. It's a good job. She got expelled from school because they said that she was mentally ill. There's something wrong with her for wanting that. There was a famous case of an activist named Petite Jasmine who had her children taken away from her because, again, the Swedish state decided that there was something, even though her ex-husband was violent, had been arrested, she had taken out a restraining order against him, but they gave custody of the children to him. And in this particular case, it was very famous because she was forced to have only supervised visitation with her children. And during one such supervised visit, the husband, who was a violent lunatic, killed both Jasmine and the supervisor. But this is the man that the Swedish state had thought was more appropriate to have the children than a sex worker. So there's a lot of punishments that are levied against sex workers in the Swedish model countries. Just because prison is not one of them doesn't make it some kind of utopia. So that's the one, and the philosophical problem with it is the closest thing for American listeners that I can come up with to closest analogy would be statutory rape laws. If you've got a girl who's under the legal age in that state, I grew up in Louisiana where it's 17. So let's just say 17 Louisiana, right? So I'm 16 years old. If I have sex with a guy who's older than me, which I did plenty of times when I was 16, right? And we were caught, what does the law say? The law says basically that I'm not morally competent. He's competent, I'm not. So even though I went into it with open eyes, even though I made a choice that my choice cannot be held against me. I can't be put in jail for having sex with a guy who's older than me, but he can be put in jail for having sex with me. He's basically my moral superior. Now, when one of the parties is underage, I can see the argument, right? Because, a teenager's brain hasn't completely finished developing yet. We understand that. They have less experience. But in the Swedish model regime, what they're saying is that all women are in that class and all men are in the other class. And so therefore, basically what you're saying is that a woman of any age is the moral inferior of a man of any age. There was even a case a few years ago where a boy, I say boy, there was a big sting, and this young man was arrested and held culpable under the Swedish model laws, and he was only 17. The woman that he was soliciting was 28. So she's not responsible, but he is. A 28-year-old woman is less morally responsible under the Swedish law than a 17-year-old male.
Yeah, I agree. So getting away from sort of the legal framework to it, I think a lot of people can get on board with legalization and decriminalization of prostitution. But
well, they're different. They're different. Legalization and decriminalization are two different things, and we want to be very careful with that. And that's the prohibitionists like to roll them together, and they do that on purpose, because legalization is not really much better a system than decriminalization. I mean, than criminalization rather. And so they want to be able, what the prohibitionists want is to be able to point to problems with legalized regimes and say, oh, look, see, decriminalization doesn't work. But they're talking about legalization, not decriminalization. One example of legalization is Nevada. You can work legally if you submit to a background check, and you submit to being fingerprinted and photographed, and you submit to having your name in a document in the sheriff's office forever, and you work for a licensed pimp in a brothel far out in the desert away from human habitation. And that's the only way you can work legally. And that system is so odious that 99% of Nevada sex workers do not use it. Fewer than 1% of the sex workers in Nevada work legally. And that's a fairly typical outcome in legalization systems. And Queensland, Australia has probably one of the highest compliance rates for licensing in the world for any licensed regime, and their compliance rate is 10%. So 90% of Queensland sex workers prefer to work illegally than to work under the onerous conditions required for legalization. In the former British Empire, all those countries pretty much all share kind of a legal framework, and that even includes a lot of the African colonies, India. They all shared that one legal framework, and that was basically that sex work itself, prostitution itself, is legal, but so-called pimping and brothel keeping are not. Well, I'm standing right now in my apartment. I see clients here. Mm-hmm. By British law, that makes this a brothel because I see clients here habitually. Technically, if I were living in England, the only way that I could legally be a prostitute was to only go and see clients at their house, not to ever have them come to me. Because as soon as they come to you, it's a brothel. And if anybody else receives any money from you, so if you work together with another girl, if you have a driver, if you have a maid, if you have a booker, like a secretary to take your calls, anything like that, that person is considered a pimp. And so, yeah, you can, in those countries, you can work legally if you work alone and only go to clients' places, not your own. If you only do the most dangerous kind of sex work. Because even if you let somebody else know where you're going, even if you tell your friend, hey, I'm going to this address, that person then becomes a pimp.
Yeah, and I'm glad we got that distinction out of the way before moving on from the legal side of it. But I think a lot of people can get on board with decriminalization on some level, but there's still this gut feeling that they want sex work to be a taboo, even if it were completely decriminalized. And so I imagine you think that would be a bad outcome. So make the case for the moral more social necessity of normalizing?
Well, I mean, on the one, for one thing, Zach, it's interesting that you say that because yes, you're absolutely correct. That's a common thing people worry about when sex work was decriminalized in New Zealand. One of the concerns people had was that it would become normalized. And when the New Zealand government did its 10-year after report back in 2013, because it did decriminalize in 2003, one of the things they were very proud to report in this thing was that the stigma hadn't gone away. So yeah, I think a lot of people do think that's a good thing. I think people have this misconception, this belief that if sex work is not illegal, if it's not harassed by cops, then hordes of women are going to be out there doing it. Mm-hmm. The fact is that's simply not true. It's not true any more than it is for any other job. Every job in the world that's legal doesn't have a long line of people, waiting to do that job, right? Everybody likes different jobs. Everybody wants to do different jobs.
Would operate demand like any other job, right?
Exactly. Being a cab driver is perfectly legal, but you don't have some gigantic glut of people trying to be cab drivers. Being owning a store is legal. It doesn't mean that there's just there's this endless stream of people who want to open stores. Sex work simply isn't for everybody. And what New Zealand discovered, and New South Wales, Australia, the only other place that has decriminalization, they discovered the exact same thing. The numbers don't change. Mm-hmm. More women do not come pouring into sex work merely because you've decriminalized it. It's simply not a factor. Just like it's not a factor. We know anybody who knows even the most basic things of criminology know that punishments for crimes don't deter crimes. We know this. And sex work is not an exception, even though it should not be a crime. Women don't choose to not do sex work merely because it is illegal. That's not a factor at all. And they don't suddenly flood into it merely because it's not illegal. It's neither here nor there. What I would say to answer your question is the argument for normalization, which I think will eventually happen, is the same argument for the normalization of anything else. Is that self-ownership? Individuals own themselves. No person should be stigmatized for their choices that do not harm other people. Nobody should be stigmatized because they smoke pot. Nobody should be stigmatized because they do sex work or they pay for sex. Nobody should be stigmatized because they're queer. Nobody should be stigmatized because they're kinky. These are all things that nobody should be stigmatized for being a gun owner, right? If something is not hurting somebody else, then to stigmatize that thing is collectivist. It's anti-individual, and it promotes a police state, because as soon as something is stigmatized, there will be a certain group of people who are going to be there arguing and pushing for that thing to be policed.
Mm-hmm. So you think that the connection between even people who want to say something like, yeah, it should be decriminalized, but sex work is still immoral or something like that, you think that that's not as final, or that's not as fine a line as they want it to be?
I think, if I'm understanding you correctly, and if I'm not, please correct me, I have no problem with, I'm bisexual, and I have no problem with there being people in this world who think that me being with other girls is gross. Mm-hmm. And they have the right to say that. They have the right to say, ew, you shouldn't do that, and I think that's gross, and they have the right to carry around signs and say I shouldn't do it, and they have the right to make a website that says, all lesbians are going to hell. They have a right to do all that stuff until they start paying thugs to come after me and inflict violence on me. That's the line to me. The line, you can think everything you want. I mean, personally, I think green leafy vegetables are nasty, but I wouldn't want a law that said people couldn't eat green leafy vegetables, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have no interest in watching professional wrestling, but I don't want it banned. And that's the distinction, I think, is that people have to realize that your own personal tastes don't require, and that can include moral tastes, don't include, that doesn't give you the right to inflict violence on other people to stop them from doing those things.
Right, and
is that what you were asking, or were you asking something different? I'm not getting it.
More something along the lines of, there are people out there who think that, of course, it's unethical to try to coerce someone into not participating in sex work, or to try to forcibly forbid someone from participating in sex work with the state or otherwise. I was more concerned about people who want to say it's still a moral mistake in some sense, maybe in the same sense that other things paternalists like to target as a moral mistake, to participate in sex work. And I mean, I'm trying to think, it's basically exclusively philosophers who would make this type of argument. But they might think, for an example, a woman participating in a market transaction with a man over sex is somehow exploitative of the woman inherently, which is interesting.
I guess people can certainly have that, but those are the same kind of arguments that a woman's place is in the home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's the same sort of an argument. Women shouldn't be fill in the blank, whatever the fill in the blank is. Women shouldn't be pilots. Women shouldn't be doctors. Women shouldn't be whatever. Women shouldn't have children unless they're married. Mm-hmm. Women shouldn't get themselves sterilized at an early age. Mm-hmm. And there's all these sorts of moral judgments people make, right? And they're annoying. I have friends who had to fight very hard to get sterilized because doctors wouldn't do it because they were too young. One friend of mine had the very clever thing. She got her boyfriend to go with her, pretend that they were married, tell the doctor that neither one of them wanted kids. And once he got, quote, permission, close quote, from her, quote, husband, close quote, he was willing to sterilize her. He wasn't willing to do it when it was her as a single woman. So these things are annoying and problematic, but guess what? If I had to live with that for the rest of my life, and that was the worst we had to deal with, I'd be perfectly fine with that. Annoying, busybody people, I think, will always be with us.
Right.
As long as they don't have the power to inflict violence, that's, to me, the moral dividing line. In a perfect world, nobody would judge anybody. But we don't live in a perfect world. We never will. So I'm not I'm basically not gonna waste any. You know what I'm saying? I'm not gonna waste my energy worrying about something that can't be done away with.
It's really a matter of private choice and not a matter of public judgment, right?
Correct. Yes, correct. And private choice is always, right, there's always that thing. There's always people who are not going to like you for doing whatever, right. I mean, stripping is legal right now, kind of more or less. But my mother disowned me when I became a stripper. So, I mean, obviously to her, it was not an acceptable moral choice. And even though I dislike that, and even though I kind of wish it had been different, at the same time, I can't consider that a societal problem.
All right. And I think at this point, most people should know answer to this. But to you, what do you think the role of sex work will be in society?
The role of sex work, what sex work does in every society, ideal or not, so sex work provides an out. I don't think it's controversial. Well, it is in certain circles, but I don't think among most people it's controversial to say that men tend to have a greater and more indiscriminate sex drive than women do. Men are interested in sex more often, with a larger number of partners, and they have a lower entry to that. In other words, what kind of woman a man will choose to have sex with is a broader category than what kind of man a woman will choose to have sex. Men's criteria are lower, I guess is the best way to put it. And because of that, there's always an imbalance. Men basically as a group, want more sex than women as a group are willing to provide. And so there's a need. And when there's a need, a market will rise, right? I mean, we get this, we understand this. It's very simple economics. Those women, that subgroup of women who are willing to fulfill that, to make up that difference for a price, set that price, and they become sex workers. And so what sex work does for society is it mops up that overflow, so to speak. It provides an outlet. When a man has an urge for extracurricular activity, whether it's because he's not married yet, or whether it's because he's married and he's a horn dog, or because his wife is not interested anymore, whatever, he's going to get it from somewhere. And he could get it by seducing the girl next door. He can get it by going with somebody else's wife who's also trying to stray, whatever. And there's any number of things. But those methods of dealing with that impulse are iffy, right? We've all seen the dramas, and some people listening to this have probably lived those dramas where the guy gets the girlfriend and then, oops, now she wants him to leave his wife and marry her instead. Or she complains he's not spending enough time with her or whatever. When a guy comes to me, I want to spend exactly as much time with him as he pays me for, and not 1 minute more. I have no interest in calling him when he's not interested. I have no interest in him leaving his wife. I have no interest in any of that. And so the social institutions are undisturbed. 70% probably or more of my clients are married. And that means that they are able to get that impulse out without disturbing the home. They don't have a girlfriend the wife can discover. They're not generally spending more than they can afford, which with a girlfriend they might, right? Especially if she starts getting demanding. So these things, it provides a safety outlet. It's a harm reduction approach, basically.
So there's an interesting implication that might come of that, and I don't know if anyone's done studies on that. It seems like a lot of the things that people point out are problems under patriarchal society, which might stem from this mismatched demand between men and for sex, you think might be reduced by decriminalizing and normalizing sex work?
I think these things are going to happen one way or the other. The sex work will, as I said earlier, sex work is not going to get any more common if it's decriminalized. Mm-hmm. It will not become, more guys are not going to go than go now, because a lot of guys go now. I mean, maybe it may increase a little bit.
Right.
I don't think a lot. And what I think will happen is that you will eliminate a lot of the negative fallout that criminalization creates. We see this to use an example. I live in Seattle. We now have legal cannabis here. I just, not 20 minutes before you called me, came home from a pot store and bought some edibles. There's no evidence that in Washington, in Colorado, in the other states that have legalized recreational weed, that the consumption has increased. If anything, the consumption among teenagers has decreased. Now, the studies probably need to be replicated more, but it still is interesting, isn't it?
Right.
And we've seen that crime has decreased. Mm-hmm. There has been a noticeable, distinct drop in crime. Why? Because with a normal market product, you don't have these exorbitant prices. You don't have the black market necessity of, dealing in side streets and dealing with shady characters and all that sort of thing that you do in a black market. And so when you legalize pot, you don't increase consumption. You don't even really increase availability. What you do is you eliminate a lot of the negative side effects that attempting to suppress it created. And that's what would be the same with sex work. It's not going to decriminalizing sex work isn't going to change that social dynamic of the men seeking us out, for sex that they can't get from for free, basically. That's not going to change. What would change is a reduction in the number of harmful side effects from attempting to suppress it.
Right. I wonder, and this is just me thinking out loud, the line you had earlier about how there's just this overall mismatched demand between men and women for sex. Like, I wonder
Sure.
how much that causes things like sexual harassment in workplaces and elsewhere and stuff like that. And if
Well, sure it does. I mean, because men, they've done some studies that show, for example, there was a study a few years ago. I don't recall the number of people in the sample, but let's just say it was 50 men and 50 women. And what they did is each person in each set, each man had to talk for a few minutes, like 5 minutes, whatever, to each woman. And then they filled out a little report saying what their impressions were. And one of the things that was really interesting that they discovered that when they asked the men, how attractive do you think that woman found you? Men invariably reported that they thought the woman found them more attractive than the woman in the same interaction reported that she did. So, like, in other words, if the guy said, oh yeah, I think she thought I was a 7, the woman would say, no, I thought he was a 4. And this was repeated over and over and over. Very, very consistent. Whereas the other way, women were pretty good at determining how attracted men were to them. Men are very poor at determining how attracted women are to them, which means that things like sexual harassment, sometimes it's a power issue, but sometimes it's just that the guy misreads cues. Sometimes the guy thinks that the woman is interested in him and she's not. And so he misreads her signals and keeps pursuing her even when she'd rather he didn't.
Do you think if it were socially acceptable for a man to get that outlet through sex work, that type of behavior would reduce on the margins?
It might reduce some. I don't think it's a cure for it. I'm not going to go around saying decriminalize sex work to end sexual harassment. I don't think it's going to happen. Frankly, I think guys are horn dogs, and they're going to, if they think a girl's interested in them, the fact that he has an appointment with me next week isn't going to stop him from going after that secretary, because she's there right now, right in front of him now. You know what I'm saying? Right. I just think that's just the nature of the beast. So I don't really foresee that. And we have seen that in societies where the more sex work is considered permissible in a society, the less it's criminalized, the less it's stigmatized, the lower the rate of sex crimes tends to be. Mm-hmm. It's not dramatic difference, but it is a difference. One study found there was something like a 17% difference, which is appreciable. I mean, it's not dramatic, but it's appreciable. And of course, we've also seen that the number of sex crimes has gone down as porn has become more readily available. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think that there is an effect of some kind, but I don't think it's a panacea.
Yeah.
I don't think if we decriminalize tomorrow that suddenly rape would go away. I don't see that. I think that's a kind of a foolish, assumption.
Yeah, obviously. I did want to get to this before we get out of here, but obviously it's really easy to analyze sex work as simply a feminist issue that is about men and women, but there are trans sex workers and gays.
And male sex workers, and there are female clients. Oh yeah, absolutely. I have female clients. I have had trans clients. I've had, and there are male sex workers. There are, there's, and a lot of sex isn't sex, right? A lot of what we do isn't sex. I have gentlemen who don't actually really want what you or most people would think of as sex. And certainly when you get into things like dominatrices, that's even more so. My friend Mistress Matisse, who's a dominatrix, a lot of her clients don't want anything that most people would interpret as sex. But even myself as an escort, a lot of times it's more hand-holding and talking and acceptance and that sort of thing. It's a safe environment.
Right. And
I'm not saying that's everybody, but that's there. That's part of the equation.
And I've known of, like, for an example, I've known a few refugees from countries like Ethiopia, like Kenya, where homosexuality is completely decriminalized. And these are largely gay men. They're also trans women and lesbians in this group. And when they go to their sort of second part country, it's usually Kenya or one of those countries. They're faced with no other options than to become sex workers. Decriminalization obviously hurts them and LGBT people, oftentimes men, and they're
you mean criminalization
or criminalization? Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And their most vulnerable position. All right. One last question before we get out of here. What are 3 books, documentaries, articles that you think anyone should read if they want to become learned on this topic, or really anything else that have influenced you?
Oh, that's a tough question.
I stole it from Ezra Klein.
Gosh, that's a really tough question. I think one of the things that people should read right now, if Amnesty International did a very exhaustive report on the benefits of decriminalization a few years ago. I want to say 2015 it was released, and that's probably something that if you're really into this and you don't just want to take my word for it, that's something you should read.
What's the name of it?
It lays it out. It's got one of those institutional names, but it's Amnesty International, the big human rights organization. They did a report on the decriminalization of sex work a few years ago. I don't know the exact name of it, but
all right.
But it's one of those
type
of things, It's got one of those long academic titles, but that's definitely one thing that you should read. I've got a video that has just come out, The War on Whores. Mm-hmm. It's a new documentary. It's about an hour long. It's available on Vimeo, and that's another thing that it's a good summary of not only of my activism, but of the increasing war on consensual adult sex that the United States government has been conducting, and with a special attention to the billionaire Swanee Hunt and her program of buying off the prosecutor's office in Seattle, and basically a billionaire setting policy by bribing the DA. So I think that's kind of it's only 1 hour long. I think it's well worth your time. That's 2. Third, that's a toughie. I can't think of a third one right off the bat. There's so much. It's the thing, right? I can't boil it down to a third. There's a bajillion things. Brooke Magnanti, I guess, who worked as Belle de Jour, and she wrote The Secret Diary of a Call Girl. She has a book. The British title was The Sex Myth. The American title was Sex, Lies, and Statistics. But it's the same book. And that's a very good analysis of the statistical bullshit that prohibitionists use to try to make it look like sex work is more dangerous than it is, that coercion is more widespread than it is. And she basically really takes it apart and says, this is what these people are doing. Here's how they're playing with statistics. Here's how they're creating these false numbers. So I think if I had to pick a third thing, that would be the third thing. But there are so many good ones, right? There's hundreds of good things. Sex work Twitter. If I can list sex work Twitter as though it were a book, follow sex workers on Twitter, because they're constantly putting things out, and a lot of it's going to be. I just saw just today, in fact, who was it? Now I'm drawing a blank as to who it was, but a well-known libertarian writer was just today talking about how much he's learned on Twitter from following sex workers, because it's dynamic and it's real time.
Yeah. And
so there's a lot more than you can get. And I say this even as a librarian who loves static books, that living book is in a way very superior for something like this that changes every day, because then you can get those viewpoints and you can get the different angles and, in real time.
All right. Well, thank you very much for agreeing to do this today.
Sure enough, Zach.
It was a very thoughtful conversation. Thank you for listening to this episode of Mutual Exchange Radio. I'd like to thank Maggie again for doing a fantastically informative interview. Stay tuned for next month's episode with Lynn Ulbrich. Lynn is the mother of Ross Ulbrich, the founder of the dark website Silk Road. Ross was arrested under legally dubious circumstances in which his rights to privacy and due process were not recognized and is currently serving a prison sentence. Lynn has since become a passionate advocate for the right to due process and privacy in this internet age and for her son. My conversation with Lynn focuses on the details of her son's case and the dangerous and important precedent it sets for the future of internet privacy. Until then, you can find us at patreon.com/c4ss.org. That's patreon.com/c4ssdotorg. From there, you can support this podcast and other C4SS projects by making a monthly pledge of $5 or more. Plus, we've extended the opportunity to be listed as an associate producer on the show. Anyone who pledges $10 or more a month before April 15th will get a shout-out at the credits of episode 4. And those who pledge $20 or more will gain access to additional content from our guests and scholars. Thank you for your support, and look out for more fun prizes for our Patreons coming soon. Finally, a special thanks to all our current associate producers on Patreon: Derek W., David Colbert, Wendy Stoyleroff, BT, James Tuttle, Casey Jamal, Ackneralls, Cecil Dion, and Danny O'Brien. Thanks to our associate producers on Patreon again, and thanks to all of you for listening. Join us on our next episode, and until then, check out c4ss.org.